y'all, Dixie here. Today I want to talk to you about some tips I feel every backpacker should know about trekking poles. My first tip is start with the cheaper trekking poles and then see what you like as you go forward from there. Quality trekking poles, aka the expensive trekking poles, are very nice, but trekking poles are one of those gear items that you can actually skimp on from the beginning and then upgrade as you go. One example of a pretty decent quality but inexpensive set of trekking poles is the Cascade Mountain Tech trekking poles you can find on Amazon. They used to be closer to the $20 range. I've noticed that they've gone up near the $30 range now, but the pair that I saw today are still under $30, so not bad. With these trekking poles, I've actually tested out a pair myself, and the only thing that I kind of had to mess with a little bit was the locking mechanism screw, just to tighten it up, because I noticed my poles were slipping a little bit. If you're gonna start out the gate with a more expensive set of trekking poles like Leckies or Black Diamonds, those are really nice poles and I don't blame you, but I would say if you're a newbie, then become an REI member and get your trekking poles from there. That way you can return them even after you've used them if you decide you don't like them. My next tip is if you're a first timer and the trekking poles feel a little awkward, start with one pole. Using trekking poles can just feel kind of unnatural to start with, or at least for me they did when I went on my first backpacking trip, which was my through hike of the Appalachian Trail back in 2015. And I knew most of the people who had successfully completed a through hike had trekking poles, so I decided to get a pair. I mentioned to a couple that I met on my first day that I didn't know how to use them and they felt kind of awkward, and they suggested just start with one pole, kind of like you would a walking stick or a cane, and that'll feel a bit more natural. Once you get used to that, then you can incorporate the second one, and by the end of the first day I was using my second trekking pole. But just starting off with one definitely helped. My next tip is a big safety tip that I learned the hard way, and that is don't tuck your trekking poles up under your arm while you're walking. Sometimes through hikers will tend to multitask while they're walking. Maybe you need a snack, and so you're eating a snack while you're on the go, something that you've just pulled out of your hip belt. So you need a free hand and you tuck a trekking pole or two up under your armpit and keep walking while you're eating. Or maybe you're checking gut hook and you've got them tucked under there. Regardless, for whatever reason, do not recommend doing the tuck, because I basically impaled myself with my trekking poles doing this. I was walking with them up under my arm, I tripped, reached out with my arms, and the tips poked my skin, and one of them, it punctured it pretty good. It definitely could have been a lot worse, but that's why I'm saying it's not a good idea to do this. And maybe in general, it's just not a good idea to multitask, and I should just make time to sit down and take breaks to snack.
Come here. You okay? Yeah. You want to eat my trekking poles, don't you? Don't gnaw on that now. Quit.
Next, protect your trekking poles, specifically the grips, from deer and mice. Because the handles of your trekking poles can absorb the sweat, especially the cork ones, which I do prefer, critters can find them tasty to chew on. I've actually heard of deer like running off with trekking poles, and then I've seen where mice have chewed on the trekking pole handles. So it might not be a bad idea to kind of rinse your grips off ever so often. But if your trekking poles are not part of your shelter setup, then I'd say break those suckers down and pull them in with you at night, so you don't have to worry about getting the grips chewed on or the whole trekking pole going missing.
If I stayed here, I wouldn't have no cork handles left.
My next tip is cork grips are not as slimy as other grip options for trekking poles. Basically, you've got three options: cork, foam, and rubber, and I would say that they get slimy in that order. You could argue that foam is a little softer and it's kind of in the middle ground as far as feeling gross and sweaty, but cork grips seem to work best with sweaty hands, and it's natural when you're backpacking and exerting yourself that your hands are gonna get just sweaty and kind of gross. So I'd rather have something that absorbs it instead of feeling like my hands are slipping on the grips. This is definitely a personal preference thing, but I think most people do prefer Cork grips. So start with that and then see where you end up from there. And next up, trekking poles will help prevent your hands from swelling while you hike. I've heard of the few people that I have seen not use trekking poles on trail complain about their hands getting swollen while they hike just because they're hanging down by their side all day and not really doing anything. So using those trekking poles will help keep your arms active and stop the blood from just flowing down into your hands and blood and fluid and whatever else collecting and making your hands feel swollen. On top of, they obviously help save your knees on the downhills, etc., etc. Trekking pole tips are typically replaceable. Eventually, if you use your trekking poles long enough, the little metal tips at the end are going to get worn down. I've heard that the newer Cascade Mountain Tech trekking poles, the budget-friendly ones I was mentioning earlier, actually have glued-in tips. I did read that some folks were able to like boil the tips and then remove them. I haven't personally tried that, but I would say most sets of trekking poles will have replaceable tips, especially the higher end expensive ones that you wouldn't want to have to replace the entire trekking pole. This may seem like duh, but I had everything to learn starting with my thru hike of the Appalachian Trail. So my REI trekking pole tips were worn out by the time I got to Maine, and somebody had to actually tell me like, no, you don't have to replace your trekking poles, you just get the tips replaced. So anyway, consider yourself informed. Next tip, lever lock systems are superior to twist lock systems. When you're selecting trekking poles while shopping for a pair, you'll see that they can have different locking mechanisms. And this is just the way that you undo them when you want to collapse them down and then lock them into place when you extend them. I have just found that the lever lock system tends to be more bulletproof, and also it's easier to adjust if you find that your locks are loosening up and your trekking poles are slipping a little bit. Usually it's just one little screw on that lever, easy peasy to adjust. If your trekking poles come with rubber tips on them, they are removable. The reason I mention removing them before use is somebody commented on Facebook saying that they didn't know you were supposed to remove them, and so they were wondering, you know, why things seemed a little weird. The rubber tips can be useful though for situations where you're hiking on hardened surfaces or just solid rock. If you know the place that you're going is going to be on solid rock, the metal tips will actually slip and not give you the traction you need. The rubber tips also come in handy on treks like the Camino, where you're walking on sidewalks or roads. And finally, I highly recommend keeping the rubber tips, even if you think you won't ever be hiking on hard surfaces, because when you fly, if you've got a cloth bag, that can help keep your trekking pole metal tip from punching through the side of that cloth bag in your checked bag if you're flying to go backpacking somewhere. Finally, last but not least, a little rule of thumb for the height of your trekking poles. When you use them, your arms should be at a 90-degree angle. That's not a 90-degree angle, but this is, you just can't tell. Okay, there we go. This does mean that when you ascend or descend, then you might need to shorten or extend your poles respectively. I typically don't take the time to stop and do that, but that would be best practice. All right, y'all, well, that is all I have for you today on tips about trekking poles. If y'all have any other tips that I did not mention in this video, please feel free to share them in the comments below, because everybody's still learning here, even if we've been backpacking for years. Thank y'all so much for watching, and if you found this video useful, don't forget to share with a friend, and we will see y'all next time.